Hey everyone, cheers and welcome to this episode of Coffee and UFOs. This is, other than when I've read the report, the AARO report, this is the first episode that I'm doing without a guest. So, what I'll be doing in this episode will be selecting items and aspects of the AARO report, the Volume 1 historical report, so called, and breaking down some of the issues that I had with it. So I have my notes, I have my PowerPoint prepared, and so this is going to be definitely a different approach towards how we do the show. So thank you for anyone who jumps in here and checks out this presentation. So for me, I do try to keep my tolerance of the hard-nosed skeptic and debunker because sometimes they do make good points, and not everything in this report is bad. Of course, there are some good aspects to the AARO report. That said, there's a lot that's wrong with it, so we're going to go through that. Please forgive. I have a cold or something that hit me, so I'm doing my best to try to speak clearly. I'm really stuffed up right now, but because I originally had guests scheduled tonight, it was Jim Garrison and Osvaldo Franco from the Paradigm uh, Research Institute that would discuss the disclosure movement, but they actually had to reschedule for next week. So I'm doing this kind of presentation instead. All right, so let's see. Hey, Maria, how are you? It's good to see you. Thank you for joining. Hola, ¿es todo bien para mí? ¿Cómo está? All right. Let's get going. So the Arrow historical. Oh, thanks, Maria. Yeah, yeah. It's not horrible. I don't feel as bad as when I've had like an intense, COVID situation, but you know, all good, all good. We'll get through it. Okay, so the historical report. Where do we start? Let's start from the beginning. So last year, before the report came out, we got some information about what the budget of the report might be. Hey, Dagger Spells, much love to you too. Thank you. Um, because when we're looking at this 64-page report, and the last I don't know, what is it, 20, 15 pages are footnotes and links. So it doesn't have a lot of weight and body. So I was curious. Okay, so how much time and effort did go into this, what was supposed to be an in-depth report? And I know it's volume 1 of volume 2, but it's pretty thin. So just looking back, but I couldn't find the exact budget that was allocated, but I did find that last year, in 2023, Kirsten Gillibrand was pushing to get more funding for Arrow. Quote, almost no funds to sustain the critical research and development work needed to sustain serious investigations. It took a letter to Defense Secretary Lloyd J. Austin III from me, Senator Marco Rubio, and 14 others to get the office temporary relief for this fiscal year. That was reported last year. And the requested amount was $11 million. So if they're requesting $11 million, where did they start? Did we have, a million, 2 million seed money for Arrow? I'm not sure. But what I will say is, if you're just looking at volume 1, and if we assume volume 2 is the same size or maybe double, I don't see a justification here for 11 million, let alone, $1 million. What is presented in this report, to my mind, is not all that different from a book report by people who already have done the research. You could have hired probably 2 or 3 maybe seasoned ufologists, historians that could have put this together in really just a few weeks' time. Of course, then you had the added expense of having to go to the other departments and inquiries, interview members. That takes time, sure. But considering how long Arrow has been existent, it is very difficult for me to believe that this is what we got with all that money. So moving on. From the very beginning, before all this started, way back in 1940, 7, we are familiar with this memo. This is the Nathaniel Twining memo, a Nathan Twining memo that is most famous because in the memo it says the phenomenon reported is something real and non-visionary, not visionary or fictitious. This is September 23rd, 1947. This was his memo to the commanding general of Army Air Forces in Washington, D.C., Brigadier General George Shulgin. Okay, so this wasn't included at all in the historical context of this. I mean, they really should have done like a photocopy of this in the report because you're making this report for people who are not familiar with the subject. This is quintessential to the UFO history. Now, granted, page 2 of this same memo, and this would have actually been to Sean Kirkpatrick's benefit, is down here, section H2, the lack of physical evidence in the shape of crash recovered exhibits, which would undeniably prove the existence of these objects, that has been used by people to make the argument that the Roswell crash never happened, because this memo occurred, several months after the alleged Roswell crash. The counter argument to that, of course, is he would not have put that in a memo. He would have been smart enough to be a little more covert about his requests for more funding for a more clandestine operation. That is speculation. We don't really know for a fact. So, which is all the more reason why you would think Sean Kirkpatrick and the AARO team would have actually included this, but they did not include it because I think you have to include page 1, and there's a number of lists of items that describe what the crafts are, and these aren't just orbs that are floating through the sky, right? They're quote circular or elliptical in shape, flat on bottom and domed on top. We have descriptions of silver-like craft. So these are all reports from qualified military personnel way back when. Again, if you're just joining me, please forgive me that I have a little bit of a cold that I'm working through, so my voice is a little off. Okay, so that brings us on page 16 of the AARO report. He mentions a Project Bear report. That's from 51 to 54. It was the name of the contract given to the Battelle Memorial Institute, and that directly related to the release of the special report number 14, which many in the UFO world are familiar with. The report assessed that if more data for unknown cases were available than most of these cases could have been explained. That leaves the door open, right? So yeah, we probably could have explained these away, so there's nothing to really think about here. But from our perspective, from a ufological perspective, and we're seeking the truth about UFOs, that tells me that there's an element of gaslighting. They're trying to push our attention away and elsewhere, and so this started way back when in the early days of government treatment and programs and investigative bodies of the UFO phenomena. Because how do they know? How do they know these cases could be explained? It's actually a very unscientific thing to say. You can't say, I don't have data, therefore the data that I don't know that I have would explain the non-data that I have. It's totally nonsensical. And we see this over and over again. And the AARO report really seems to lean on these old made up axioms by the government and the military industrial complex establishment. Page 17. Okay. So there was a CIA study group, which led to the Robertson panel that was kicked off in 1952 during the UFO wave, which you can argue climaxed over Washington, D.C. And the public was getting concerned, and so were politicians, and so were the military. So it was like, okay, we have to do something about this. So from the AARO report, it says, quote, in December 1952, H. Marshall Chadwell, assistant director of OSI, briefed the director of Central Intelligence, Walter Bedell Smith, on the subject of UFOs. Chadwell urged action because he was convinced that something was going on that must have immediate attention and that sightings of unexplained objects at great altitudes, quote, something was going on that must have immediate attention. Sightings of unexplained objects at great altitudes and traveling at high speeds in the vicinity of major U.S. defense installations are of such nature that they are not attributable to natural phenomena or known types of aerial vehicles, end quote. The source material does not suggest that Smith believed that these sightings were of extraterrestrial origin, only that he believed they were not natural phenomena or known competitor technology. Well, that's the exact same language that we're using today. So we're just kind of repeating, reusing, recycle, reuse. And I, if you are truly a skeptic, I understand using this language a little bit, but the AARO report, the job here is to really look at things from all angles and try to get to the truth of the matter, and to not just essentially copy and paste texts that are decades old. Um, the other concern that came out of this Robertson panel was this idea that there was mass hysteria, and the AARO report seems to kind of cling to that a little. Well, the argument here is that at the time, we're talking about in the 50s, early 50s, that people would have been afraid of UFOs, that they would have panicked. And okay, and they look at the Orson Welles broadcast of War of the Worlds that happened, almost 2 decades earlier, and they say, people at the time were totally panicked. Well, the truth is, only 2%, only 2% of the citizenry of the United States was listening to that 1938 broadcast. Was a 39. We know that now later. So those involved in the intelligence community at the time would have been well aware that whatever was printed in the newspaper was overblowing the so-called hysteria. It wasn't as bad as people make it out to be. The other thing is they're saying that people were afraid of the USSR nuclear threat, and because of that, being under tension, under pressure, for fear of that threat, that if you brought up the idea of UFOs, that it would just be too much for the American public to handle. And I simply do not buy it. And the fact that Arrow seems to go along with that uh, tells me something about Arrow. I think that there's a little bit of a dishonesty, intellectual dishonesty there. Um, and if you're going to do a report, and if you have a budget that outblows any independent ufologist's budget, you should be referring to sociologists and psychologists and getting a much deeper dig and insight on this than any past ufologist has ever done before. I mean, this is the whole point of our. We were hoping to get a line of inquiry that we simply could not get before. I don't buy it. And also, the first UFO movie happened in, I believe it was 1942. So we were already accustomed to the idea of like aliens and UFOs and this sort of thing. So it wasn't a new idea by the time the Robertson panel came out. Okay, so page 18, there's a mention of and quote and confirmed and some confirmed hoaxes. This is something that they use to kind of water the muddy the waters. So there are a certain number of cases that are unknowns and unresolved. And then they throw in this comment about some confirmed hoaxes. This has been done before. It's overplaying the idea that there is a large number of hoaxes that would account for a large percentage of alleged UFO craft crashes or abduction experiences and what have you. And so you have to really put this to the test. I think one, it's more of a modern day hoaxing that we see more than anything else than we did in the past decades. In the past, what you might get would be the Space Brother stories. And people said, I had this experience with our space brothers from Venus and so on and so forth. And I think a lot of those people were probably full of it. They were probably making it up. Not everyone. A lot of people did have actual experiences. But yes, there were these made up tales. Now, do we put someone's tale in the same category as a hoax? I don't think so. I think we need to kind of separate those and not throw them in together under the same category. A hoax is when someone goes out of their way to really try to fake something, to do fake evidence, fake photograph, manipulate the public. And so one of the cases that is often used by debunkers to illustrate this would be the Travis Walton case. And they try to say that this was a hoax. Clearly, that is not a hoax. We've covered this subject before on the channel, so I'm not going to get too deep into it. And I have more to say about the Travis Walton case in coming episodes and writings. We use this as a good example. If you can think back in time, how many cases got a lot of attention and were considered a hoax? I mean, you could probably count them on both your hands in the past 30, 40 years. So this really is a very weak argument, extraordinarily weak. So I just wanted to point that out. Modern day, yes, we get a lot of fake videos and computer generated, 3D animated videos and the like. That's true, totally true. But 99.9% of the time, we rule them out within like a day's time. So it's not an issue, and it shouldn't be undermining the overall data. Okay, so the Condon report, which many of us are familiar with, the results from this, they say the panel cautioned against support for scientific papers on this topic and recommended that teachers should not give credit to students for reading UFO literature and material. Right? That's from the Condon report. And what I like here is that AARO actually doesn't quote it. They kind of rephrase it. So now it's in their own words. And in my mind, I think this is a wink wink by AARO to say to those that are reading this, y'all are probably crazy to even consider this a serious subject matter. In fact, even like a middle schooler who wants to do a paper on, I did Atlantis, for instance, when I was younger, or UFO, yeah, you shouldn't let them do that because that's how crazy this is. And that is an absolute insult. We know that the Condon report was slanted. There's a lot of evidence to support that. Edward Condon, he was quoted on a couple of occasions as to not believing in the UFO subject. Now, to support this, I found this recording by Major Donald Keyhole shortly before the Condon report was complete. And this came out of the University of Colorado. Kehoe, on behalf of NICAP, did a press release and audio response to the goings-on behind the scenes in the Condon report shortly before the final report released. So I'm going to play that for you now. I think I'm going to play it for you now. Oh my gosh, hold on one second. Where'd it go? Okay, here we go.
The following is a transcription of the NICAP press conference on the University of Colorado study held at the National Press Club on Tuesday, April 30, 1968. The voice you hear will be that of Major Donald Keyhole, who conducted the press conference and handled all the questions.
Fact-finding organization with field committees to investigate sightings and several hundred advisors who are scientists, engineers, and experts in other fields. For 17 months, we have cooperated with the Air Force-financed University of Colorado UFO project. We have broken off relations with this project very regrettably because we have evidence that instead of being the objective, impartial scientific investigation, it was announced to me, it has been extremely negative. The director has revealed a very extreme bias. The coordinator of the project, before the contract was signed, suggested that the project be announced in such a way that it would appear to be objective, whereas actually would be handled in a different manner. Quite a bit of this is covered in our press release. We have sent a report to the President of the United States enclosing evidence of what we term grave deficiencies in this study. The study has cost over $500,000 to date. 2 top scientists have been fired by the head of the project, Dr. Condon, for revealing proposals that the study should be carried out to appear objective, and also explaining how it would actually be handled. The administrative assistant or secretary of the project resigned in protest against the way the project was handled, and also in protest against the firings. Now, during this period of 17 months, we supplied hundreds of reports at the project's request. Some of them, many of them, from such competent observers as veteran pilots, scientists, aerospace engineers, and other responsible witnesses. We also, at the project's request, briefed them on some of these hoaxes and occasional wild tales that you read about, so that they could be prepared to distinguish between the serious reports and the other type. In the field, we helped investigate quite a number of cases and gave them our evaluations. This went on until the spring of '67, when we began to notice Dr. Condon making statements to the press in which he was quoted as saying, among other things, "This is a crazy business. I don't believe the UFOs exist. I think the government should get out of this business," and so on. In case any of you care to see them, we have copies of some of these clips. Dr. Condon always told me afterward that he was misquoted, and that very well could be, but he was always misquoted in one direction. In September, he made a speech before scientists out at Gaithersburg, atomic scientists, very high-level professionals, in which he made fun of the subject and indicated that it was pure nonsense. We had a report on that from one of the scientists who was present. When we complained, there was no real explanation given.
All right, so there you have it. Now, did they include that in the AARO report? Of course they didn't. This is just another example of the provenance and lack of pertinent data that is related on the circumference sometimes of a particular topic. But without that information, we're not getting the whole picture. Okay, so on page 21, we have in 1993, Congressman Stephen H. Schiff, our Republican, New Mexico, made inquiries about the Roswell incident to the Department of Defense. Okay, so from there, he got information out of the General Accounting Office, GAO, in 1997. What we got out of that was the explanation that the Roswell crash was simply people conflating 2 different reports. One being 1956 crash of a KC-97 and a 1959 manned balloon mishap where 2 pilots were injured. And in the air crash of 1956, 11 lives were lost. So what they're saying is that decades later, in the 70s and 80s, when the eyewitnesses of the Roswell event were interviewed, they were simply confusing these events. It sounds a little bit difficult for me to believe. On top of that, they're saying they conflated these events that happened 10 years almost apart from the 1947 Roswell event with weather balloon tests, Project Mogul, that were classified at the time, and these two other crashes. So, look, memory is not perfect. We all struggle with memory to some degree. But to think that these Air Force, Army personnel, pilots, people who have been war worn and are very keen on what constitutes a threat, what is exotic or not exotic, that somehow over the years would confuse these events. So basically, if one of these events took place in 1956, that's or 1959 was the latest that they mentioned could have taken place, that they're confusing with the Roswell crash, 1959. That means by the 70s, when we get these interviews coming in from Roswell personnel, that just 15 years ago, they completely confused that event with something 30 years earlier. It doesn't jive. It doesn't make sense at all. On page 22, this is interesting. So we hear back and forth this argument about whether Lou Elizondo was really the director of ATIP and whether ATIP was actually an official program. Well, AARO speaks to this. It actually says, unlike ALSAP, ATIP was never an official DoD program. However, after ALSAP was canceled, the ATIP moniker was used by some individuals associated with an informal, unofficial UAP community of interest within DoD that researched UAP sightings from military observers as part of their ancillary job duties. This effort was not recognized as an official program and had no dedicated personnel or budget. The interesting thing here I picked up on is that they said their ancillary job duties. They researched UAP sightings from military as part of their ancillary. What does that mean? If it's not a part of their official duties, it wasn't an official organization, ATIP, and yet it was still part of their ancillary job duties, I would like to know a little bit more about that. What exactly is that? Who gave them those the free reign to research UAP? Now, it doesn't make any mention of Lou Elizondo, particularly as a director, nor does it rebuke that he was a director. So I'm not sure why that is. Maybe we'll get more in volume 2, but I think it's something to take note of, that in a sense, it kind of is recognized. And of course, we do have a letter from Harry Reid that said, yes, ATIP was a real program and Lou Elizondo was a director. So there's still a little bit of a mystery here. I think it really depends on how you interpret all this. I understand, in this case, the skeptics believing that ATIP wasn't a real thing and there wasn't really a director. I can understand that, but I think that there's a lot more that's to play out here. And because they're not giving us the sub data, the supplementary information regarding this statement, well, then it leaves the door open, doesn't it, for ATIP? Okay. So moving on, page 22. Okay, page 27, sorry. They discuss in 1950 to 51, the UK Flying Saucer Working Party had concluded, quote, flying saucers did not exist, end quote. The French SERPA report stated that 28% of caseloads remained unresolved. Well, if they're unresolved, but if they're also non-existent UFOs, why, decades later, did the UK and other countries continue to show interest in this? And why did the United States government continue to show interest in this, the military particularly? Okay, Project Sign and the estimate of the situation. Many people are familiar with the estimate of the situation, and not all who are interested in this, because it's not an official document that is yet to be discovered. The estimate of the situation is an interesting one. So apparently, during the uh, Robert's Project Sign investigation into UFO and assessment, there was a number of scientists that were involved in the research, and they came to the conclusion that what we're dealing with here is indeed, or most likely, UFOs or extraterrestrials. That's where the origin of these UFOs are from. Captain Edward Ruppelt stated that it existed, but that whatever copies remained were destroyed. This report, apparently, by the personnel involved in the research, uh, was denied and shut down. And in fact, it seemed that those employees were purged, so that there was no further contradiction to what seems to be at this time developing as the main line explanation, which is uh, UFOs are not extraterrestrial. All right, let's see. Page. Where we go? Yeah. So there's a really interesting reference to what I think is the Vandenberg uh, UFO encounter in Big Sur in California in 1964. This is where, and this isn't is not explicitly stated in the AARO report. So I'm inferring this from what they're saying on page 30. I believe this is the Big Sur event where there was an ICBM that was apparently neutralized or shot down by a UFO, and that it was recorded on film by a Lieutenant Bob Jacobs and Major Florence um, Mansman. AARO says the video doesn't exist, the film doesn't exist. What AARO does say is that people were probably confusing this with scheduled ICBM testing. So again, they're saying that military personnel would simply confuse a UFO shooting a beam of light at an ICBM and shooting it down, neutralizing it with other anti-ICBM technologies or experimental technologies. It's again, they're really kind of laughing in the face of our ancestors, our forebears' intelligence, and including our own intelligence. Also noted in the AARO report is this idea that there are no official UAP non-disclosure agreements that have been discovered in their research. So what does that mean? They're saying that of all the eyewitnesses that they spoke to, which were generally referenced to them by those that came forward to them on the record, saying, hey, I know X and I know Y worked for this secret access program or worked for this military program. And they told me they signed a non-disclosure agreement and that they worked on these experimental programs that were related to extraterrestrial materials or craft or what have you. AARO says no such non-disclosure agreements occurred. They don't exist. My argument to that is perhaps it's true. Swamp gas. That's right, Maria. Yeah, there's all kinds of forms of swamp gas explanations. What's going on here? And I explained this a couple of episodes ago. I think is, imagine Mission Impossible, right? Sure, it's Hollywood, but okay, here's your mission: destroy this message, or the message will be, self-destructing in 5 minutes or 2 seconds or whatever it is, right? So I think the same thing's kind of happening here. I think there's a psychological game. So if you're brought on to a compartmentalized or stovepiped secret access program, then I think what you're going to get here is off the record, no matter what. I think if someone is approached with a document that says, here, sign this, this is your life sentence. If you speak of this, it's considered treason and you could be subject to the death penalty. I think that's psychological. I think giving that to someone, making someone sign a piece of paper, it's a mind game. And what do they do with that paper? They don't save it. They don't file it so it can be released by a FOIA act, decades from now. That would be absolutely foolish. I think it actually makes so much more sense that they would just burn it, delete it. It doesn't exist anymore. So again, I understand the skeptics because they're saying, well, that's an easy out. True, but you have to consider every angle as you're approaching this. That's the whole point. This is a mystery. It's like any other detective going out there and trying to solve a mystery. You can't just throw everything away because it doesn't make sense yet. Just hold on to it, put it like in Stanton Friedman said, put it in the gray box and gray basket, and we'll get back to it later. This may be something that'll never exist, but you have people that are saying that they signed non-disclosure agreements that don't exist. So something happened here. There was some exchange between the government and these individuals. Okay, page 32. CIA interviewed AARO, denies story of having seen and touched a secret UAP program craft, and they signed a memorandum for the record. So AARO spoke to someone they were referenced to interview. This someone apparently had told someone else who went to AARO and reported this, that they saw a UFO. They had put their hand on the craft and touched it physically. They were that close. And it was this exotic, non-terrestrial technology. When AARO asked this person, hey, did you actually touch a UFO, an extraterrestrial craft? Did you tell so-and-so about this? They said, no, I didn't touch an extraterrestrial craft. Maybe they confused it. Maybe they confused it with a story I told about, a B-52 bomber experience that I had or what have you. Of course, again, if you knock on a member of the mafia's door and say, do you work for mob boss X? Do you think they're just going to say, I sure did? And let me tell you where we stash, all of our tax-free illegal gains. No, they're not going to do that. So what I don't like here is it's not that they're telling us what happened. Of course, AARO has to report. This is what they did. This was the response they get. But they offer no analysis here. They're not saying to the public, hey, maybe there's a reason for this response. They just take it at face value, pass it on, and hope that the press will take it and run with it. And that's pretty much what the press has done so far. And that's why this is really important for me to kind of walk through this. And it just helps me to remember all of these misgivings of the AARO report. Okay, so we are on page 32 now. Okay, so UAP had similar characteristics to an authentic SAP non-UAP tech. So this is one of the excuses that are used. Well, if it meets one of the 5 observables, sure you can say that. If it meets 5 or the 6 and the new 6 observables, then I don't think you can make this statement. But this is what they seem to be doing here. AARO seems to be saying that just because something flies and a little weird, it's an uncommon, uncanny kind of behavior at first glance, then these Navy pilots and so forth are just confusing it with some other kind of non-UAP secret program tech that is, probably an advanced drone or what have you. This is, again, major gaslighting. I think that what we have too with AARO is that there's kind of a sunk cost fallacy, because if they're already invested in this with the narrative of extraterrestrials don't exist and secret UFO programs don't exist, then no matter which route they take, we're always going to find ourselves bumping up against this dishonest wall. So basically, this is what is called a representativeness heuristic. So that is, and I'll read this for you, a mental shortcut we use when estimating probabilities. If it resembles a lion with its teeth and claws, it is probably dangerous. And I think right here, they're not even putting any intellectual effort in here. They're just going, oh, well, if it looks kind of like a whatever, that's probably what it is. No reason to really investigate further. Okay, Northern Virginia study case. This is something that's interesting. So this was a case to determine whether there is a threat to the UFO enigma, to find out more about it. The accusation was that the United States, or U.S. administration at the time, funded this study, but apparently not. So no one seems to know where the funding for the study came from, if it wasn't requested by the White House. And the case files related, these are the footnotes 107 and 108. The case files that AARO refers to are all hidden to protect witnesses. So I couldn't garner any more information out of this. What else does AARO have? Who did they talk to that are under the case files 107 and 102 categories? So aerospace companies denied involvement in recruiting ET craft. Yeah, of course. Same thing. You knock on the door, you say, hey, did you work for this supposed secret access program and develop UFO reverse engineer technology? Nope, didn't happen here. Yeah, but I have the authority by the United States government to inquire, and can you take me inside and walk around? Sure, come on in. They're not going to show you the place. It's not going to happen. Okay, so I just wanted to bring this up a little bit here. I know I brought this up before, but I think it bears repeating. They did mention what we believe to be this arts parts, as it goes, a piece of material that was recovered apparently from an alleged UFO crash. I think it was a Navy pilot had given it to Art Bell, the founder of Coast to Coast AM and host. He eventually gave it to Linda Moulton Howe, who sold it to the TTSA, to the Stars Academy. And then to the Stars Academy had lent it out apparently to the Navy to get tested. So in the AARO report, when they discuss, and again, I believe this is the material that they're referring to, when they discuss the chemical makeup of this material, my question is, are they pulling from the same analysis that the U.S. Navy allegedly did for, or in partnership with, To the Stars Academy? Or are they pulling from something separate? Now, what they said here was that it wasn't layered in any particular or strange way. You had the bismuth, you had magnesium, and what was it, aluminum? And it was just layered in such a precise way that it was clearly manufactured and appeared to have no purpose. Excuse me, no purpose technologically that we can attribute it to here on the planet. And remember, this piece came from decades ago, so we're not talking about something that's modern, right? This is decades ago. AARO seems to say, no, there's nothing strange here. So then what's the deal? If it's not strange, and yet some of the research that Hal Putoff referred us to says, yeah, the data shows us that it is strange, then there's a conflict here. What AARO doesn't do, and I'm just these next images are just here to illustrate this for you, okay? So what AARO doesn't do is that they don't do what we saw at the Soul Foundation. This is what you need to do. If you're going to say a piece of material, there's nothing strange or weird about it, then you need to publish the data in your report. We want to see the graphs. We want to see the spectral analysis. We want to see the chemical ratios and makeup. It's okay if it's terrestrial, but show us the data. Don't just give us a summary in one paragraph that you don't think that it is extraterrestrial in any way or exotic in its makeup in any way. Okay, so I touched on the Vandenberg already a little bit. We move past that. So what's interesting, the thing with the report is that on some pages, you have repeats of the same topic, because there's the initial outline of the report and then more detailed later on. Okay, so AARO is said to have granted full access to pertinent USG programs. If they really did have quote unquote full access, well, I would imagine that means they can knock on pretty much any door and get in anywhere they want. And it doesn't seem to be that way. I've heard that there's something called the Authorization 1811 that DEA detectives and other high-level detectives get, that really gives them like a superior power and legal right to gain access into facilities, into documents, and that because AARO didn't technically have this authorization, that their hands were tied. Okay, so then two things. One, if that's true, if they would have had more access, if they had authorization 1811, then AARO, you would think, should have known that, but they're saying they had full access. So how could AARO have full access if they knew they didn't have 1811? Something's not right there. There's an omission of information, pleading naive, it seems to me. If they did have 1811, I still contend that 1811 does not give you access to secret access programs. It just doesn't, especially if this is the greatest government cover-up of all time. Okay, so something called Kona Blue. A little bit of a buzz about this. What happened was, after OSAP and then eventually ATIP, what AARO says is like an unofficial inquiry into UAP, shut down, Lieberman and oh gosh, who was the other senator? Anyway, the two senators that initially got the OSAP bill started. This is definitely some brain fog going on. Excuse me. They went back to the Pentagon and said, "Hey, we really think that we should pursue this, because while OSAP was occurring, there were some of these paranormal things that were going on, and we investigated them, and then we think that there's actually a legitimate line of investigation here between UFOs and paranormal." And that got denied and shut down, of course. Now, AARO interviewed someone called Person 14 related to all this, and they asked them to sign the memo for the record, and they didn't. And I do wonder why. What if there's nothing to hide? Whether they worked with AARO, investigated with AARO or not, I don't see why anyone shouldn't sign the memo for the record. So I can understand AARO being a little suspicious about that, but at the same time, what legality does memo for the record actually have? I don't think it holds, but I don't know if it's quite the same as testifying under oath, which is why, it's strange that somebody wouldn't, testify, speak for the memo of the record. If you were hiding something like a secret access program and you were saying, no, it doesn't exist, and you said that, and you signed a memo for the record, perhaps you don't fear legal retaliation, because perhaps memo for the record doesn't hold as much weight as AARO would like us to believe. I put that question out there to see if any lawyers or anybody has any idea about that. So if anybody listening is familiar, I'd really like to learn a little bit more about how important signing a memo for a record is. Okay. After that, we come to page 36. So AARO determined that modern allegations that the USG is hiding off-world technology and beings largely originate from the same group of individuals who have ties to the canceled ALSAP ATIP program and a private sector organization's paranormal research effort. They're not entirely, this is not entirely untrue. They continue to say, persons have not provided any empirical evidence. Persons 1 through 12 were involved with paranormal research conducted under ALSAP ATIP, and this is under footnotes 120 to 123. But I'd like to know then, what were these paranormal investigations that these persons were doing? Where are the documents for that? Sure, we know about the gimbal, the go fast, the tic tac, but we need to know more if they are actually investigating paranormal phenomena, right? Why aren't they releasing that information, those documents? So I find that a little bit odd. Insufficient data and information, which we spoke to a little bit before, which I said AARO was lacking. They had insufficient data and explanation for some of the results, particularly material results that they're discussing. But then they're saying to us, well, to us, I'm speaking on behalf of all you UFO enthusiasts. No, they're speaking to ufologists and enthusiasts and people who are what they call quote unquote believers in the phenomena, that we don't provide enough data from actual events. But that's not true. And in the AARO report, they talk about how there's not enough radar data. Well, I beg to differ. So just take the time to look into the Phoenix Lights event in 1997. You have dozens of witnesses. You have a radar report, which a sighting report by a pilot, which happened to be, oh my gosh, what's Goldie Hawn's husband? I forget. Anyway, the famous actor. And then we have the JAL 1628 flight, 1987. You had two airline pilots that made visual contact with a giant UFO, not an orb, not a silver craft in the distance, something that practically filled their windshield screen. And then, of course, there was data collected from the FAA, that was squirreled away somewhere. So the radar reports are gone. Unfortunately, we don't have those radar reports, but we have enough anecdotal evidence to suggest that those reports were squirreled away, hidden away, deleted, whatever. But Phoenix Light, yeah, radar data. Stephenville, Texas, 2008, absolutely radar data that correlates with the passing over of these UFOs. And also we have jets that were scrambled. That's on the record as well. The Cash Landrum UFO incident, I mean, my gosh, if you're looking for something that has lots of data to support a UFO incident, this is one here. Not only do you have 3 eyewitnesses that were physically affected in real time and sadly were affected not just psychologically, but physically, and made sick and had cancer related to this event years later. But they had those eyewitnesses, the close encounter experience with a UFO. They, at the time, said they saw black helicopters coming in after the UFO that had landed on the highway in front of them. Then John Schuessler, who used to actually be an engineer for NASA, and he was a co-founder of MUFON, investigated this case. When he did so, he knocked on the Air Force's local base's door and said, "Hey, do you guys did you scramble any helicopters at this time?" And they came back and said, "No, absolutely not. We did not." Well, he did some more digging and found out, through another avenue, yes, you did scramble some aircraft. And they said, "No, well, we wouldn't do that on Christmas, but yeah, maybe we scrambled a couple." And this is what we get time again and time again. The people who spend the time to research this subject, you're talking about decades of investigation. So for AARO, I don't know how many people they have on this project. I don't know how much money they invested, but for AARO to come to the conclusions that they have come to, that essentially there's no evidence for some craft that's off world, off Earth, is utterly biased. I mean, there's really no other way to put it. One thing they do say, I have to mention here at the end, and it's kind of laughable, is that people started confusing UFOs going back as far as 1942. That doesn't make sense because the Roswell crash, the Kenneth Arnold experience of 1947, all that UFO craze stuff happened beginning in 1947, not 1942. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that occurred in 1945. So I think what they're saying here is that there's again this kind of paranoia that people have, and they started reporting that. But wait a minute, 1945 still before the Roswell crash and the fervor of UFO sightings and activity of 1947. So it's a little weird that they put these in here to explain away some of the fervor that the U.S. citizenry and other places across the world, for that matter, actually witnessed UFOs. Again, I have to put this in the category of gaslighting. Roswell incident, Corona, New Mexico crash, 1947. There is no way in anyone's right mind that these seasoned pilots somehow saw dummies from the 1950s like this in 1947 with balloons from 1947 to 49 that look like this, and put these pieces together, if they can time travel, and that they came to the conclusion that these were alien bodies. Annie Jacobson, in her book, Area 51, makes the claim that it was actually the Russians that crashed a faux UFO, and there were malformed bodies on there, and it was supposed to be a psyops operation against us. I think that's totally an untenable thesis. There's nothing that is sensible at all. Okay. AARO also says, well, people confused experimental craft like this back then, like the AARO car. This could only get a few feet off the ground. That's it. And there was the Horton one wing that was made of wood, and it could barely fly. And that, was not a high performing craft. So here we are. We're left with lots of what I would call very speculative approaches to debunking the UFO enigma, which is ironic because they're constantly telling us that we're the ones that are being speculative. I'm going to finish off here with a little something from our friend Stephen Greenstreet, and then I have to comment on that real quick for you.
2023, a U.S. Air Force reservist named David Grush went public, claiming that the government is in possession of alien spacecraft and alien bodies.
No kidding, non-human, exotic origin, vehicles that have either landed or crashed.
Of course, he says he's never actually seen the aliens himself. He just heard about the aliens from a certain group of people that he trusts. Do you want to guess who this group is? Yes, Grush is friends with, associates of, and close to many of the same people from this same group of paranormal activists. The same group of people who have been doing this for years now. Lou Elizondo, whose claims I've debunked. Jay Stratton, former Pentagon official / Skinwalker Ranch ghost hunter. Travis Taylor, former Pentagon official, the star of the Skinwalker Ranch show on the History Channel. George Knapp, merchant of all things spooky. Jeremy Corbell, a UFO celebrity who's been caught.
Okay, so Stephen Greenstreet, obviously supposed to be a real hard-hitting reporter, is not. And he is hyperbolic. And of course, yeah, I come on here and others, we expose our emotional reaction, and we do laugh at things that are a little bit silly and what we consider to be outlandish. But he's puts himself forward as a serious journalist, and how can you take him seriously if he puts the sort of tone and twist? So basically, what he's saying is there's kind of a circular argument. So one member of a particular group, or several members of a particular group, share information with some other people. They parrot that information, and that parrots down to someone else, and there's this feedback loop of information which creates a bias. But what's misleading about Stephen's report here is that he's showing you a page with, like, 14, 16, 18 something people on there, Leslie Keene and George Knapp and Jeremy Corbell and David Grush. And he's just saying, look, they're all connected. And that's all this is. It's just the same group of people. Well, that's not true. We know that's not true because of the same thing that we all have been reporting on, including Stephen, is that there are 40 and probably more people that are willing to come onto the record. 30 that was recognized by AARO, apparently, which means 10 more. And that is well more than this apparently small group of people that are just parroting the same information back and forth to each other. This is called an ecological fallacy, which is when you make conclusions about individual members of a group based only on the characteristics of the group as a whole. So the interesting thing about that is, and we're just going to do a little fallacy fun here, he combines a couple of fallacies, which is, oh my gosh, Texas sharpshooter fallacy. Okay, so a cognitive bias when someone focuses on a subset of their data and ignores the rest to make a point. So he's selecting a certain number of people in this group, Jeremy Cabell, etc., and saying, look at these people. They're all saying the same thing. Ergo, this is all we should look at because this is the whole truth and nothing but the truth. But he's excluding information and other people that are a part of a much broader network, or unconnected people possibly as well to the central group that he's discussing, that have information to share. So it's very dishonest. I know it's the New York Post, so they can be a little salacious, but I don't like how there's that sort of public shaming when there's no need to. And if you're a serious reporter, you shouldn't be kind of snickering and laughing and doing that kind of tone of voice. Okay, so fallacy of composition. The flawed reasoning that concludes what is true for individual parts must be also true for the entire group or system they belong to. So keep that in mind as we go ahead and and monitor Stephen's reporting. So that's pretty much it. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts that you want to share? Otherwise, I'm going to wrap it up here. But yeah, those are just some of the points that I wanted to bring up about the AARO report that were just really kind of easy picking. And the fact that any of us who are familiar with this subject can go through and find it is all the evidence that you need to know that this was not a truly in-depth, hard-hitting investigation. So apparently some other people who work in the body of AARO are sincere, but they are sort of shepherded and confined to what apparently they could say or what they can do. I don't like the outright attacks at Sean Kirkpatrick, because if indeed he's doing his job, which is to repress the truth the truth about UFOs and extraterrestrial recovered craft or what have you, then he's doing his job. Doesn't mean I agree with it, but at the same time, just if you're going to do your job, just know that we can see through the lies, and that only gives those of us who really care about the subject that much more motivation and fuel to go out there and start exposing the truth and bringing attention to this subject. All right, so I guess that's it. Thanks everyone for hanging out in chat. Sorry I didn't get to see all of your comments and questions as I was reading along here, but I appreciate you hanging out. I know this is a little bit different. Next week we do have two guests, Jim Garrison and Oswaldo Franco, and we'll be discussing future movement towards UFO disclosure activism. So they really are making an effort. And I think that we're going to see the fruits of that labor in the next year or so. The New York City rally, I think it was a good first start. It was a little weak as far as the numbers go and representation, but I'm glad that I went because it gave me some perspective and it gives us a place to kind of start and have a conversation. Okay, how do we do this better next time? What's missing? And hey, at least we got some press, so that's something. Hey, Judith, thanks so much. I appreciate it. Thanks for stopping in. Oh yeah, here's Judith's comment from earlier. Those who have seen the evidence and deny it are either told to deny or frightened. I think, yeah, I think both are true. All right, well, peace and love, everyone. Thank you so much for hanging out. This episode and all other podcast episodes on the Mystic Lounge channel can be heard as a rebroadcast on the UnX network, 2 a.m. Eastern time on Fridays and 11 p.m. Pacific time on Thursday nights. Thank you. Let's keep going after the truth. I feel like we're so much closer than we ever have. So I'll see you next week. Until next time, peace and love.